it. This is a bilingual conference. We're going to record the activity so students can watch, because we are in the exam period, so I apologize for that. Today is a very interesting issue, which is the intersection of educational policy and law with respect to indigenous people, which is such a subject. We welcome Dr. Samara Hand. She's a Bachelor of Art at University of New South Wales, and a Master and a PhD in University of New South Wales. Also Professor Sebastián Donoso, who is an expert on legislation, indigenous legislation and public policies at the School of Law. And we welcome also Professor Francisca Vergara, who is also an expert on indigenous legislation and public policies at our School of Law. This is an open discussion, although you have like 10 minutes each of the speakers, and then we can open the floor for a free discussion on the subjects. Thank you very much for your attendance.
Is that okay? There we go. That's better. I did just want to very briefly show. I think if this is working, a map as part of trying to introduce myself and also my colleagues. There we go. From where I'm from, just to give some context. So I'm a Worimi and Biripi woman, which is there we go. So where Sydney is, it's about 2-3 hours north of Sydney, along the eastern coast of Australia, in the state of New South Wales. And so my mother grew up on a mission that was run by the Catholic Church, as did my grandmother. And my grandmother wasn't allowed to attend public school; she had to attend the missionary school. My mum was the first amongst her generation that were allowed to attend public school. So that's sort of the family history of education, but also where I'm from. So I've grown up on Sydney, and I think my other colleagues will probably introduce themselves, and I'll leave that map up because it's helpful for kind of positioning ourselves. So my paper today that I'm very much looking forward to discussing is on the right to education. And by way of sort of background, this paper is for a chapter on children and the law. But it emerged from my PhD research, where I looked at how we need to better embed the right to education within state law in Australia and Canada. So I was doing a comparative study between Australia and Canada. And I wanted to, I felt that it's necessary to take a step back and first consider, is there anything that needs to be questioned about the right to education itself and the way in which it's framed in international law, before considering how do we better embed it in our own national law. And so this paper is, I guess, a presentation of my thoughts in attempting to do that and attempting to question some of the fundamentals concepts that are built into the right to education. So the right to education is protected in core international human rights treaties, the Universal Declaration on the Human Rights, Convention on the Rights of the Child, International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, amongst other instruments, and of course the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And there are mechanisms or elements of the right to education that are helpful for Indigenous peoples and help ensure that education is culturally relevant. So there's calls for cultural pluralism within education, for example, and the aims of education that are stipulated within international law. And there's also very express prohibitions on discrimination within education. And in UNDRIP, there are also specific prohibitions on using education or any other kind of state system to assimilate Indigenous peoples further. So those are kind of helpful aspects of the right to education when thinking about what can the right to education, as it's written in international law, offer us as Indigenous people. But I think there are also some still problematic fundamental conceptions within the right to education, the kind of foundational concepts that sit within the way in which the right to education is framed, that I just want to question or unsettle. So I draw on Tuck and Yang's notion of unsettling that they've set out in their quite famous paper, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And of course, reclamation of land is really central to decolonization. But part of that reclamation and unsettling that Tuck and Yang talk about is also unsettling the colonial kind of frameworks and systems that continue to influence society and the systems in which we operate. So I sort of take their call to action up in this paper to question some of those fundamental concepts. So the first one primarily is the notion of education that's embedded within international law. Although it's framed more broadly as the right to education in most instruments, it becomes quite clear through the wording and then also through the interpretations that the right to education is the right to school. So a particular model of education is kind of formulated or embedded within the right to education. And that's only one model of education. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia, like I'm sure many Indigenous people around the world, we've had our own systems of education for thousands of years before the sort of Western model of schooling has been introduced. That's a relatively recent phenomenon, born out of the Industrial Revolution. And so I think confining this notion of education to schooling limits the potential for what education could look like. And yes, there is recognition of non-formal education within international law. The right to the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to education has even issued specific guidance on non-formal education, but it's very much framed as a way to fill gaps within the formal school system. So it's seen as the school system is still kind of held up as the most fundamental and core way of doing education. And non-formal modes can kind of just fill those gaps. They're secondary. Indigenous, and so my paper mostly looks at perspectives from Australia and Canada because that's where I've spent most of my time. I mean, I am from Australia, but I also spent 2 years in Canada as part of my doctoral research. So I draw mostly on perspectives from those two contexts. For Indigenous people, education is a much broader concept. It includes, and education is very much based on learning from country. Country is first teacher, and it's also very much a communal activity and responsibility. So it's not necessarily the responsibility of the state, because of course we think the state framework has been imposed, but it's more a community collective responsibility to ensure education. And so there's different kind of that influences the way in which education is framed and approached. The other foundational concept or notion that I sort of question within this paper in relation to the right to education is the notion of childhood itself. So at the time of the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there was a particular perspective of childhood as not yet adults that was kind of embedded within and reflected in the discussions that took place around the framing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and specifically that right to education. And it provided the justification for making schooling compulsory. So if we don't ensure that children go to school by making it compulsory, they won't be able to develop all the skills and knowledge necessary to become competent adults that participate freely in society. And again, that view, although even within kind of Western academic thinking, we've moved beyond that notion of children as kind of blank slates that need to, be given all of the information and skills. That is one particular view of childhood, and we know that childhood is a kind of social construct because what counts as, who is a child has changed throughout history. But again, that reflects a particular perspective. So in many Indigenous communities, children are seen as being born as already complete beings with their own kind of sense of agency. And so that also influences how you approach education. So in many kind of Indigenous child rearing practices, for example, children are able to kind of indicate when they're ready to sort of move on to the next thing. And so for that reason, like mastery approaches to learning are often taken up and have a lot of relevance for Indigenous communities. And so I'm not necessarily saying that we have to do away with compulsory education, but just questioning the sort of justifications that are embedded within these foundational concepts. Because compulsory education has been, particularly historically, but it continues to be, I think, a problematic legal tool within our country. So, within Australia, for example, compulsory schooling provided the means to remove Indigenous children from their families, to force them into what was often very subpar education environments and schools, training them for sort of domestic labour and agricultural labour. But today it continues through truancy laws. So Aboriginal families, or any family really, but Aboriginal families don't send their children to school, even though that might actually be an act of resistance against a system that is not being responsive to them. That can provide the means to essentially criminalise their non-attendance through fining the family. It can lead to further action. And so my, I guess, challenge in this paper is like I said, not to do away with the notion of compulsory schooling, or the laws around compulsory schooling, but just kind of to rethink the fundamental concepts that underlie the justification of it. And then if we're able to, my, I guess, idea is that if we question those fundamentals and then rethink, well, what does education look like, and what should the goals be for Indigenous communities, it's really around community development and self-determination. And so, if our goals are, instead of building a competent adult that's able to participate fully in society, and more around building individuals who are part of a community that care for land and continue our culture, language revitalisation is a key goal for many Indigenous communities. That changes, I think, the focus in education and what counts as the metrics of success. And so one thing, I think one limitation within the right to education as it's currently framed is, although there is the right of Indigenous peoples to self-determination over education, most prominently in Article 14 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, elsewhere in international law, that right to control our own education systems, I think, is somewhat constrained by the requirement that, so even if we develop our own schools, for example, they have to follow state minimum standards. So they have to follow the regulations that are set by the state. And so I think that somewhat limits the potential for Indigenous communities to do education in a way that is responsive to their own community goals and needs. Of course, we have many Indigenous people working within the education system to try and ensure those minimum standards are reflective of our priorities. But there is always, I think, going to be a kind of contest there between trying to get our priorities in versus the state priorities. And I think there's always that sort of limitation. So I'm not calling in this paper to do away with the right to education entirely, of course, but just to question some of those fundamental concepts. I think a lot of the literature within international human rights law, when you read about it, particularly in regards to minorities and Indigenous peoples, it's about trying to ensure access to schooling and improve access to schooling. But I think that we need to question some of those fundamentals and think about, well, is schooling the only option? And if we take a step back and look at what are the priorities and needs of communities and aspirations, then what other possibilities might that give us for fulfilling and meeting the right to education? So I'm sure that was probably 10 minutes. I can leave it there. Yeah. I guess one of the key aspects that I point to as one of the sort of, it highlights some of the limitations, is the Coolangatta Statement on Indigenous People's Rights to Education, which I just wanted to mention because so it's not technically part of international human rights law. It's a statement that was issued by a collective of Indigenous people who gather at the World Indigenous Peoples Conference on Education. I think Chris and I just attended the most recent one that was in Auckland in New Zealand. And this was signed back in 1999 in Coolangatta, Australia. And And so I think when you read through the Coolangatta Statement on Indigenous people's right to education, you can see kind of key distinctions between the way in which the right to education is framed in that statement versus an international law. And of course, that's because in international law, it's states negotiating, and it goes through so very much the process of negotiation and making sure that it reflects states' interests, even though Indigenous peoples are obviously very heavily part of the discussions for UNDRIP. The Coolangatta Statement hasn't gone through that kind of political process of states potentially changing the wording and that to reflect, their priorities. This is a statement that is straight from Indigenous peoples, and so I think reading that is important because it highlights some of the limitations of the way in which the right to education is framed in international law. So there's much less reference, for example, to specific kind of levels of schooling like there is in international law, and very much foregrounds, I think, the elements of self-determination and desire for control over education, the importance of relationships with land, the importance of elders, and the importance of language revitalization, for example. I think one of the key, just to sort of give it a practical example, one of the key sticking points, having worked in Indigenous education for a while, is, who counts as a qualified teacher, for example. And so that is set by national law, or for us, state law, like within New South Wales. What do you need in order to be a qualified teacher? And we have, elders who have immense knowledge that we want to share, and they want to share it with young people, but they're not deemed a qualified teacher according to education law. And so that's sort of been a sticking point because it means that they can't necessarily get paid the salary of a teacher. And so then we're trying to find innovative ways to recognise the knowledge that they do have, and give them to sort of work around that. And I know that's something that we're trying to work on at the university, for example, is how to give them the qualification that they need in order to then be considered a teacher. But that's just sort of one practical example that shows how the state minimum standards, as they're referred to in international law, can limit the way in which we then want to approach education. With, in Indigenous communities, elders are, one of the primary and most important teachers because they hold so much knowledge, but they're not necessarily valued in the same way within Western kind of legal frameworks. Yeah, I'm happy to leave it there.
Let me begin with a small disclaimer. Education is not my focus is mostly on indigenous rights in the context of my comments come from Tarango. And second, although I research and work on these issues, we approach these topics from an external academic perspective. I will connect some of the ideas of, I'm going to try to connect some of the ideas of Samara with Karen Engel's work on culture and development, and it depends on the time. I will find for discussion, or we can do that later. One of the great strengths that I found and I was highlighting is that it takes a right that we usually see as positive, the right to education, and unsettles it. And it shows how its implementation can, in some contexts, reproduce colonial control rather than expand indigenous autonomy, which is the final aim of indigenous human rights. In that sense, Samara invites us to question the idea compulsory schooling is always and everywhere especially when it ignores indigenous philosophies of childhood and learning. Another central point that I would like to highlight, linked to the aforementioned, is that resonates strongly with contemporary debates, is that the right to education, as currently framed, offers only a very limited form of indigenous self-determination. within state-defined structures of schools. I don't want to repeat what Professor Samara already said. So, but in part, from a self-determination perspective, Professor Hunt argues that there is a very narrow understanding. That's my understanding. Interestingly, Professor Hunt not only critiques like how to explain, but rather she proposes to respond to these limits and set limits. The right to education, meaning the latter to reimagine the right from indigenous perspective, including some matters like decoupling education from compulsory schooling, treating education not only as an individual right of children, but also as a collective right of peoples, and grounding the right to education in indigenous self-determination and models of learning, bottom-up models of learning. So in reimagining the right, what I find very interesting is that there is no single indigenous word. So Samara is cautious to not fall in like romanticism in sentences. So although she recognizes there are common themes like relationality, land as teacher, and community responsibility, she recognizes that there is also huge diversity in how different indigenous people understand childhood and education, for instance. I found this crucial because, in my view, essentialism itself can become a form of colonialism. National law and sometimes states tend to use neat categories, and if we are not careful, these labels can create a particular image of what it means to be indigenous, often rural, land-based, traditional, ecological, and marginalize indigenous who do not fit that image, like urban children, mixed families, or those who want strong access to mainstream education without giving up their identity. So in this context, let me bring in with Karen Engel's work, which helped, I think, to see more sharply what is at stake when indigenous culture is brought into legal frameworks. Engel, which is very well known for this book, The Elusive Promise of Indigenous Development, identifies three main ways in which international law tends to understand indigenous culture: culture as heritage, culture as land, and culture as development. And each of these provide normative basis of protecting rights, but also a dark side. And I will briefly link each of them to education. First, culture as heritage. Here, culture is understood as traditional practices, ancestral knowledge, languages, and worldviews that should be preserved. Education, this could translate into curriculum reform, for example, adding indigenous languages, history, and symbols, recognizing intangible heritage, including indigenous content in textbooks. All this can be positive, but there is a risk. Culture can become museum-like. It is treated as something to be preserved and displayed rather than something lived and transformed by indigenous peoples themselves. It might also shift control away from indigenous communities. States, universities, or even UNESCO-style bodies might position themselves as the guardians of indigenous heritage, deciding what is worth preserving and how it should be taught. The risk in education might be that indigenous culture become a curricular object instead of a space of self-determination. The risk also is that indigenous culture might become, students learn about indigenous people, but indigenous people may lose control of how their own knowledge and identities are defined, used, and transmitted, how they are taught. Second, culture as land. I don't know how. Here, culture is rooted in ancestral lands and territories, and the idea is that land is essential for the survival of language, knowledge, and identity. Applied to education, this pushes us towards land-based learning, community-based tools, and forms of education strongly connected with territory, which is very consistent with many indigenous philosophies. Again, this is powerful and like positive, but Engel warns that it can slide into a very rigid idea of indigeneity. True indigenous peoples are those who relate to land in traditional and sustainable ways, and only in those ways. In education, this may mean that only certain traditional forms of land-based schooling are considered genuinely indigenous, while others, for example, indigenous teen programs in cities or diverse professional aspirations, are seen as less authentic. The risk might be here that land becomes so sacralized and so narrowly defined that it limits indigenous educational choices. It may end up constraining projects that indigenous communities themselves consider compatible with their own identity and development, simply because they do not fit an external image of authenticity. And finally, third, culture as development. Here, culture is linked to indigenous people's right to define their own life projects, what we often call self-determined development or etnodesarrollo, like Engels. This looks, at least at first sight, like the most dynamic understanding of indigenous culture. It recognizes that indigenous people can design their own economic, social, and cultural futures. To get any education, this would mean supporting indigenous people to create their own educational systems, curricula, and institutions, aligned with their own visions of how education should be done. However, Engel warns that even this model can be captured. States, donors, or international organizations may start deciding which forms of indigenous development and which forms of indigenous education are acceptable. Usually, those that look traditional enough, or green enough, or not too disruptive with existing ancestral and traditional powers. In practice, this might generate pressure in indigenous communities to adopt certain land-based educational models or bilingual models, while discouraging other projects that are equally indigenous, but less easily recognizable from an external view. So, like we can see, across these three models, heritage, land, and development, the same pattern appears. Recognition of culture can come with hidden conditions. If those conditions are defined from the outside, they can quietly limit indigenous educational sovereignty, something that Samara has already highlighted. So from a self-determination perspective, I think this suggests two things. First, culture-based rights in education should not be interpreted against indigenous choices. Second, any protection of culture must be read together with the right of indigenous people to decide collectively what forms of education are compatible with their own contemporary ways of being. And just some final things. And if we accept this critique, we still have a practical problem. How do we center indigenous perspective in educations without creating new sensitivities? I think that Samara chapters give at least three useful directions, which I see that are very consistent with Engels' broader concern. First, protect plurality, not just one model. Second, recognize collective self-determination, not only individual choice. And finally, to unsettle the right to education, in Samara's, what I understand that Samara sense, is to open space for non-school-based education to be recognized, funded, and validated with indigenous people. So decide. So, although these directions do not give us a neat formula, and there's probably a good thing, they imply an ongoing political process of negotiation, where indigenous voice led, and where international law is not the only authorizing source of this process. Thank you.
Okay, last and least, Wiyabu Samara. Is that okay? Yeah, Wiyabu and Wiyabu to all to our visits today. Thank you for your presentation, Samara, and congratulations for your paper. And again, a warm welcome to all our visitors from New South Wales University. I'm happy that we had a conversation. When was that? In July, August? I think Professor Nicolas was present also. Was it July, August, I think. So I'm happy to see that that initial conversation is blossoming.
Yes.
And now you're here today, and maybe this is good ground for future cooperation. And we agreed with Professor Vergara that I would try to give a sort of a context or general background of educational policy with respect to the indigenous peoples in Chile, so that we can maybe see to what extent your main critique or your argument in your paper applies in Chile. And maybe that can be ground for future cooperation in the future. So first, well, of course, same disclaimers as Francisca. I'm no expert in educational policy and with respect to indigenous peoples. I'm not an indigenous individual as well, though I've been teaching for more than 20 years here in the faculty. And I think that's it for disclaimers. So I thought it was good to begin with a very brief explanation on the current provisions of law that we have in terms of educational policy and indigenous peoples. And if I have to summarize that, we have 1, 2, 3 main legal bodies that have connection with your paper and your argument. The first is the indigenous law, the Indigenous Act, that was passed in 1993. It's sort of the umbrella law for indigenous peoples in Chile. And of course, together with ILO Convention 169, are the 2 main legal bodies regarding indigenous peoples in Chile. So the Indigenous Act has 2 provisions that are important for this conversation. One is that there is a, in the areas of high concentration of indigenous population, the educational system must develop and put in place a system of bilingual intercultural education. So it's called Programa de Educación Intercultural Bilingüe in Spanish. Okay? So that's one provision, and the other provision that is important to mention is that the law that provides the financing for all the government bodies must establish special resources for an indigenous scholarship that is applicable to all levels of education, primary, secondary education, and university education. That from the point of view of the indigenous law, and of course the indigenous law also promotes the indigenous cultures and languages. That's a general provision of indigenous law as well. Then we have the ILO Convention 169, and there are a number of articles of the ILO Convention that refer to this issue. Of course, the right to access to general education. That programs must respond to the particular needs of indigenous peoples. And also that teaching must be oriented to allowing students to read and write in their languages. Then we have the General Education Act, and this is interesting. This is a general law in Chile, but first it establishes a principle of interculturality. Okay, we say interculturalidad in Spanish. So that's a founding principle in the General Education Law. And then there's another provision saying that if a school has a certain number of indigenous students, or goes, beyond a certain threshold of indigenous students, it's mandatory for the school to offer what we call sort of a sector lengua indígenas. The name in Spanish is indigenous language and culture subject. So it's mandatory for the schools to teach this subject. It is not mandatory to take the course, and that's an interesting point. So it's mandatory to offer it, but it's not mandatory for the students, even for the indigenous students, to take this subject. And one last thing in terms of context, we are now in a process of, so we have 3 types of schools in Chile. Maybe you're aware of it, that is important maybe to mention it. We have public schools, we have private schools that are funded by the state of Chile, and they're called colegios particulares subvencionados, so they are private, but they are funded by the state. And then we have private schools. So public schools used to be handled by the municipalities, so at the local level. So over the last years, we are in the process of trespassing all the public schools from the municipalities to the general, to the state. Chile is a unitary state. So now we have one service of local public education per each region of the country. And in some cases, there are two public services per region, depending on the number of schools. So that's another challenge in terms of how the system, the educational system is drafted in Chile. So in terms of educational policy, we have 5 or 6 elements that we have to consider. We have a system of bilingual intercultural education. It is mandatory for the educational system to provide this, this subject. There are some differences between primary and secondary education. So there is, the subject is called language and cultural education. Cultural education for primary education, and then in secondary establishments, they have more flexibility to build the subject. And then there's a difference between, we have 11 indigenous peoples recognized by law in Chile. Okay, so the Mapuche people are the majority and well known, at the global level. Of those 11 indigenous peoples, only 4 have, what we'll say, and I have to be very cautious with this, but live languages. So it's the Aymara, the Quechua, the Rapa Nui, and the Mapuche people, they have live languages today. So the government, this subject that is mandatory includes, of course, all the contents necessary to preserve and maintain those live languages. But also, for the rest of indigenous peoples, there is a concern on the languages that were at some point lost or limited only to academic activity or very formal ritual activities. So the contents are in terms of history, culture, and language. And in the part of language is especially important for the 4 live languages within those 11. So we have that. We have also a very interesting role that is called the traditional teachers. We call educadores tradicionales, traditional teachers, okay? So that they are established by law. There's a decree that regulates this role of traditional teachers. They have to be appointed or approved by the local communities that are, close to the educational establishment. And they are the ones who teach this subject, language and education and culture. Then we have the indigenous scholarship, and I think I mentioned to you in our conversation, Samara, that there's a very interesting study that was made by a professor of the University of Delaware and a professor of this university on the performance of the indigenous scholarship in Chile. The main conclusion of this study is that the education transfer via this, indigenous scholarship have reduced long-term inequality, ethnic inequality in Chile. So that's interesting. I'm not going to mention, the details, but I think it's important to mention it. So all this, and there's one other thing. In Chile, there's a right for every person and every organization to create educational projects. So every person can, propose an educational project, and of course that is open to indigenous people and group and organization. So when we think in terms of self-determination, and we think in terms of the issues that are highlighted in your paper, I think that's one of the issues that we have to bear in mind. So as far as I know, from my conversations with people that are involved in more detail with these issues, we have mainly 4 challenges. One is that the number of traditional teachers is far below the number that is needed. It's more or less there are sort of 500 traditional teachers in Chile, and we have 700 public schools. So we have a gap of 200 traditional teachers. That's one issue. Second issue is that there's a lack of implementation of the subject in a number of public schools. So it's mandatory by law, to provide the subject, but not all the establishments have been, able to implement this subject. Also, we have issues of access to indigenous scholarship. It's been very successful, as I mentioned before, but not all the people that apply for the scholarship gets this indigenous scholarship. So it's a problem of the amount of resources that is devoted to indigenous scholarship. And finally, I don't have the precise figure, but I was told in a meeting last year that there are only 1 or 2 indigenous educational projects. I don't remember right now, the number of schools in Chile, but of course, it's a very small number if you take in consideration all the schools in Chile. So I think one could try to further, dig, in all these aspects to make, connections with the issues of your paper, and maybe that's room for future cooperation. And one last thing, and I know this is a very hard issue, and I try to be very, very cautious because I know it's all the issue of residential and boarding schools is quite a big issue in Canada and Australia, New Zealand, etc. Nevertheless, it strikes me somehow that even though we did have a colonization by the Spanish, not by the English, and we have mission schools in Chile, in the south especially, the Anglican Church and the Catholic Church have mission schools, and probably they were not that different in terms of their origin as to the experience in your countries. But nevertheless, it has not been an issue, as long as I know, for the last 20 or 30 years, or not a big issue in terms of public policy in Chile. The issue, for example, I've never seen a petition by indigenous groups in Chile asking the state for what is the word? Sorry, for apology for what happened with the mission school. So there is something in the way mission schools and religious schools were developed in Chile that maybe make some differences with the situation in Anglo-Saxon colonization countries. And the other thing is in the north of Chile, and that's a different situation. The regions of the north of Chile are part of Chile only since the 19th century. After the Pacific War, Chile won a war against Peru and Bolivia. So the regions of the north of Chile are part of Chile only since then. I'm talking about 1980, 1990. So there were no mission schools as far as I know in the north of Chile, but there was a process that we call Chilenization. So Chile implemented, a huge effort to Chilenize, so to say. To incorporate those regions, and they used the school as a means to promote Chilean culture. And I understand that the Catholic Church has had an important role in those schools in the north of Chile. So different story and different situation than the mission schools in the south, but also important to take into consideration. So that's it from my part. Thank you so much again. And
Thank you.
That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian. Thank you, Sebastian. It was really helpful, I think, to get some of the context and see some of the synergies. I think I'm happy to comment back. This is more of a discussion. I might start with you, Sebastian, just while it's fresh in my mind, and then I can come back to you, Francesca. The 4 challenges that you outlined, I think, have sound very familiar. I'm sure Annie, Chris would agree that in terms of some of the key challenges, so thinking about, beyond the kind of conceptual sort of challenges outlined in the paper, there's these practical challenges to trying to implement self-determined education. So we similarly don't have enough language teachers in Australia. So there's a lot of, I think, goodwill. We have legislation that protects Indigenous languages in New South Wales. So in our state, not every state has it because we're a federal system. But in New South Wales, we have the Aboriginal Languages Act, which protects the Indigenous languages of New South Wales. And so the government has made commitments, including through funding, to teach Indigenous languages in schools, and like we have language nests, which is a model similar to in like Hawaii and New Zealand, where the school is kind of used as almost a community hub to help revitalize language. But a key challenge is that we don't have enough language teachers. So that's a kind of another focus as well, as trying to build up the language teacher cohort. The lack of implementation of the subject, I think, is similar. So, and Auntie Chris could probably speak much more to this, but we have a national curriculum, and then we have state and territory curriculum as well, which tries to sort of implement the national curriculum in a more, I guess, sort of relevant way to that particular state. So, like in New South Wales, we implement the national curriculum, and it is mandatory in our national curriculum to teach Indigenous perspectives across all subjects. It's meant to be implemented across all subjects. It's referred to as a cross-curriculum priority. But there can be a sort of lack of implementation as well. It might be because teachers don't feel confident in implementing Indigenous perspectives appropriately. They just, fear of getting it wrong, just not knowing enough themselves. A really crowded curriculum that can, I guess, leave little time. So we have that similar challenge as well. I think we have, I think, a lot of funding and scholarships. I know you mentioned the issue around funding and scholarships. But I think one thing I've been trying to think of or recognise, and I think that requires a bit further research, is so when thinking about how to implement more self-determined education, I suspect that I think that really links to economic and depends on economic self-determination and economic sovereignty. So communities having access to their own funding, which is a challenge within a system where, even though we have land rights, the land rights frameworks that we have in Australia don't really facilitate a lot of projects that would generate income for a community, which contrasts sharply, for example, with the United States, where I know of communities that completely do what they want in their schools, so they have their own schools and are able to do what they want because they're completely self-funded, I think primarily through casinos that they run in their communities. So they don't rely on funding from government at all. So I think there's a link here, which, of course, probably seems obvious, between education, self-determination, education sovereignty, and economic sovereignty. Because, government are always to obviously have, different kind of financial priorities. Then you mentioned only one or two Indigenous kind of educational projects. I guess maybe this is where there's a sort of slight difference. I think we have quite a few independent Indigenous schools in Australia, and more, I think, or more and more communities are thinking about developing their own school within our kind of independent school system. So there are some similar challenges, but also some key differences. And I'm intrigued by your mentioning the kind of different history of the mission schools here. I guess that's potentially an area for further research, is that kind of distinct history, because we have had a full commission of inquiry into the history of our school system, and more specifically into the removal of children to go into those schools. And we had, the formal apology from our Prime Minister in 2008. That's 2008 apology. So, I'm curious, I guess, what that looks like here, and also that project of Chileanization in the north. So that's potentially an area for further research. And then, Jessica, turning back to your comments, I really loved how you framed it around Karen Engel's three sort of challenges, the three frameworks. I think that's a really interesting way to think about it, and the limitations that each of the framings can have: heritage, land, and development. That's really something I'm going to have to think about more, speaking directly to Karen Engel's work. And I think you captured the kind of key problem is, how do we centre Indigenous perspectives without essentialising them? And I think that's where self-determination is really key. Input and control. So, even if Indigenous peoples are establishing their own schools, I think there still needs to be a lot of input into the public school sector as well. So I think it's about how input and control to ensure that it doesn't become essential. Of course, going to be an ongoing challenge. But I think your point around protecting plurality, which is sort of the main argument I'm putting forward in the paper, is really the way to ensure that and having that at every level, so from law down to curriculum, down to classroom. But it's not an easy project to implement. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I think that's why the more I think it can be a sort of bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach, which is difficult within state systems where education, law, and policy is set at a kind of national or at least subnational level. To try and then facilitate more of a bottom-up approach is difficult to, I think, to work out in practical. You want to have self-determined education, it needs to kind of be that bottom-up approach. So how do we make space within law and policy, I think, to enable challenge. I think you mentioned you had a question as well. Did you?
I think you already did those questions, like how this can be looked at in practice, and finally, if it's even possible, because sometimes, and it is and then really liberal points to some like the lived indigenous culture, and in the other extreme we could have the coordinates. So how can we approach all this plurality without leaving anybody out? I don't know if I'm explaining this. Because probably because one of my main preoccupations, or like one of the things that I question myself, is this idea not to tend to have a stereotype idea of indigenous. And then when we talk about self-determination, it's not bottom up, and we just have this idea of how an indigenous person should be. Finally, we are going to have curricula that looks really cultural, but maybe it's not like indigenous culture is today, like contemporary ways to be indigenous. And I know that I'm talking about from outside, like a non-indigenous person.
Yeah.
But that's one of the key questions that I have, and not only in this field, in every field where you have to look at culture within legal frameworks, like in natural resources, the same way that we've been making. What is negotiable and what is not negotiable from the self-determination. Like, is there any limit for indigenous people? Is there any space where culture is something that you need to protect even from indigenous people? Do you understand what is that?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting and tricky question. I mean, I guess you're touching on the kind of notion of what's his name? Repressive authenticity. This idea that it needs to look a particular way, and if it doesn't look that way, then it's not indigenous. And I think that can already happen sometimes in, or that like tokenism, without it being kind of really genuine and profound. I think I think it's a big challenge, but I think that's where like the community role, so not just having kind of one or two people, but I think it really being a kind of collective responsibility. It always has been in indigenous communities. Multiple people taking part in the kind of conversation, or in the projects and the education. Track and focus to ensure that we're not kind of reproducing hierarchies and kind of throughout. I think is the if I fully
No, it's
answered
okay.
your
I
question.
think it's kind of an open question, and there is further research to do. And culture is, I'm not anthropology, an anthropologist also, but culture is dynamic, and the question is how much can evolve into we still can say that it's indigenous culture without like falling in essentialism, but at the same part, we want to that the idea is to continue and maintain indigenous culture. So that's the tension that you already explained.
Yeah, maintain but also develop. I mean, all cultures develop over time, right? Like no culture is stagnant, so allowing that at the same time. Yeah. Yeah, I don't think I have a straight answer for that. It's like a challenge for everyone, I think, in this space to, as at a community level, I think, to be. Any further?
A lot of thoughts. One on right, and I want to.
think strangely within Australia, we kind of already are well positioned for that because we've got the independent school sector where you have religious schools, just schools with different educational philosophies, you know, like Montessori and that's sort of the system under which Indigenous schools have, like independent Indigenous schools have developed. So they're not being funded on the basis of being an Indigenous school. They've just registered as an independent school. They go through that kind of the same requirements, of course, of having to satisfy like school, the regulations around, you know, what's required for a school, child safety principles, all that kind of stuff. And then they're able to just kind of deliver the curriculum within reason how they want. So there's nothing kind of within that regulation process and registration process where they have to be like, oh, this is how we're going to be distinctly Indigenous and do our education program. That's actually for them to do at the end of the day once they've ticked all of the kind of usual regulation requirements. There are limitations there because, of course, those regulations don't fully respond to how Indigenous communities necessarily want to do education, but there's nothing there that actually goes where the community need to be like, oh, this is what makes us Indigenous, this is how we need to do it, because it's the broader independent kind of system that we've established within Australia. I don't know if there's a similar.
Not the thinking in education, maybe it's that simple. At least from define who is indigenous, the system in la Corporación Nacional de Desarrollo Indígena, CONADI, that in charge of indigenous. And these organisms can issue a certificate stating that you are indigenous because you comply with certain hypotheses. But what has been interpreted is that you are not indigenous because of the certification. Rather, you are indigenous because you are in some of the where one of the strongest one is at least from that point of view, we want to say self-identification, not self-determination. If we think at that point, although limited within the state, again, there is a space where self-determination or self-identification comes from person, indigenous person. There a similar system in organizations. It is a really simple way to explain it.
Maybe I can add, you know, another point of view. I mean, maybe I will move a little bit away from the issue, but trying to connect it. But when we think in terms of the role of the state, my feeling is that for the last 20 or 30 years in Chile, we have been mainly speaking about the ILO Convention 169. You know, most of the conversations have been when first Chile has to be part of the ILO Convention 169, and once we were part of ILO Convention, how we implement it. But that is in some way it's a very discussion because we are always speaking of what the state has to do in order to comply with this, you know, with these norms. So there's very little on self-determination and as such, or it's in the margins of the discussion, but not in the. So maybe in the coming years, if we are able to overcome some challenges that we have as a society, it's good to remind that we have two constitutional processes. Well, aim to have a recognition of indigenous peoples in the constitution, and we failed 2 years ago. And we have a huge discussion on legacy issues in terms of lands and land reparation. So I was, as I listened to you, I was thinking if we were prepared even to discuss about self-determination or this critique to compulsory education and the role of public education, because we have so huge issues that are still untackled and unresolved. So maybe I escaped a little bit from the question, but I wanted to add that because and the issue of interculturality is interesting because we are all speaking of interculturality as the principle that should frame the relationship between the state, the indigenous peoples, and the society as a whole. But when you speak with some indigenous groups, and it happened in this university some years ago, some indigenous groups that are urban here in Santiago, they said to me something that was sort of frightening in some way. Is that they look with suspicion the principle of interculturality. So as they were suspicious with multiculturality, as a notion. Even interculturality is some of them view it as a principle that again is a state promoting this view, but not them. So well, anything. And one last thing. We can, approach all this discussion from the point of view of indigenous peoples, but I always try to put over the table what happened with the rest of the population of Chile, because the issue of interculturality and how do we see indigenous peoples, how do we relate with indigenous peoples, is also a matter for us. So I said, I remember once I was in a debate. I was in the television, so I just need to mention this because my children, my children were watching this program TV, and I said in this TV discussion that the Mapuche language should be mandatory for everybody, and teaching, even for my children. When I got home after that, I had some critiques from my own people. I would say, well, we have to learn English, we have to learn Spanish. Why should we be obliged to also to learn Mapuche? And I'm convinced that we should do that. But it's also an issue for the rest. I mean, so the policy with respect to the indigenous peoples is not only for indigenous peoples, it's for the rest of the country as well. And if we don't do that, we don't do that, we will be always failing to the issue as a whole, I think. Sorry, am I?
like the emotional, the burden, yeah. Mm. 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 Yeah, I mean, I don't think we probably have captured that enough. I think it's probably well known within our own communities how much work it takes and how we kind of burn out. Mm. Yeah. Mm. 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 No, no. Mm. Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a good point. I don't know how many times does government consult with indigenous community before something happens, you know, I think, yeah, what's the quality of that consultation? Mm. Implemented. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Excellent. Any other? I think as a closing remark, I just want to thank everyone. I think this has been a really fruitful conversation and given me more things to think about as I sort of develop this work and think about the interconnections with other countries as well, like including Chile. What does that look like here? So yeah, I'm really, really grateful for this opportunity to look through the paper and learn from both of you as well.
Oh, and maybe just to add that it's a small attendance, difficult time of the year for us here, but at least 3 teachers of the faculty are here. It's also Professor Alejandra Brecht from the master's program. So I agree. I mean, very good conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your paper with us, and we are open, of course, to continue cooperating in the future. Maybe here, and not only here, but also in Sydney, maybe.
Yes, yeah, come visit.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for all the
Thank you.
questions.